So this is just a blow-up of the data we looked at earlier for the UK, showing GDP growth on the left-hand side and unemployment on the right-hand side. And we said that those two variables are related through Okun's law. When GDP growth is high, the unemployment rate tends to be low or decreasing. And when GDP growth is low or negative, the unemployment rate tends to be going up. And so the last sort of important variable that we want to think about in terms of macroeconomics is inflation. And so inflation is just an increase in the general price level of the economy. And so it's not one price, but it's some weighted price index based on what consumers buy, what producers buy, what we produce. And so there's going to be a lot of different price levels. We'll talk about them in a minute. This is based on what's called the Consumer Price Index, so it's based on what households typically buy. And you can see that in the UK, they had very high inflation during World War II, which is often common during wars, that decreased substantially when they went back on the gold standard. Um, they had deflation, as did a lot of countries during the Great Depression, at least until they went off the gold standard. Had higher inflation during World War II, and then had higher inflation during the 1970s. And since the 1970s, inflation has been decreasing, as it has been in most industrialized economies. One of the interesting things is that inflation tends to be lower during recessions and higher during expansions, although that correlation has not been as true recently as it was, say, in the last 50 years. If we look at sort of trends in inflation around the world, we can see that inflation, can vary substantially, but generally, for most countries, at least since 2000, has been somewhere between, 2% and 10%. And so there have been some spikes, right? So we saw spikes in Latin America in the late 80s, early 90s, spikes in sub-Saharan Africa in the mid 90s. There were spikes in a lot of countries in the 70s and early 80s. But for the most part, inflation has been coming down since about 2000. And we'll talk more about inflation as we sort of move forward and talk about monetary policy as well. So as we said, measuring inflation can be done with really any price index, right? Any price index can measure inflation. It just depends on what you want to measure. And so the consumer price index is a good measure for prices that consumers face. So it will include housing, food, gas, entertainment, all the things that consumers spend their money on. And in the United States, there are different measures even of the CPI. So there's the CPI-U, which is measured for urban families, urban households. There's the CPI-R for rural households. There's the CPI-W, which is for wage earners. And it's the most common measure of inflation, which is just the percent change in CPI. Another measure is the GDP deflator. And so remember, the GDP deflator is just nominal GDP divided by real GDP, right? And it tracks the components of GDP. So it's C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And so that's another good measure of inflation. And if you look in the United States, as we'll do in a minute, they tend to go up and down together. But just remember, it depends on what you want to measure in terms of which inflation measure you should use. And whatever index you're using, inflation is the percent change in that index. So here we have three different measures. We have the CPI-U for all items. That is the blue line, and this goes back to 1947 for the United States. We have the CPI-U taking out food and energy prices. So food and energy prices tend to go up and down a lot. They tend to be more volatile than other prices. So sometimes we take out food and energy. We call that core CPI. And the GDP deflator, and so that's the green line. And you can see that they tend to go up and down together. We had sort of spikes right after World War II as we sort of got off price controls. Then inflation started increasing slowly in the 60s. And then we had a couple of price spikes related mostly to the oil shocks, but also to wage price spirals. Then the Federal Reserve started controlling inflation much more carefully and signaling that they were going to control inflation much more carefully in the early 80s. And so inflation has been pretty low, sort of between 0 and 5% since then. So the 90s, we had a spike above 5%, and then we had some increases during the expansion of the 2000s. Inflation has been generally low since the end of the recession. Um, so one of the interesting questions is whether inflation is going to increase as the expansion continues. So we're going to talk more about inflation when we talk about monetary policy, which will allow us to discuss the role that the central bank plays in monetary policy and inflation.